This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. What I Saw in America by G.K. Chesterton. Section 13, Chapter 7, Part 1. The American Business Man. It is a commonplace that men are all agreed in using symbols, and all differ about the meaning of the symbols. It is obvious that a Russian republican might come to identify the eagle as a bird of empire, and therefore a bird of prey. But when he ultimately escaped to the land of the free, he might find the same bird on the American coinage, figuring as a bird of freedom. Doubtless he might find many other things to surprise him in the land of the free, and many calculated to make him think that the bird, if not imperial, was at least rather imperious. But I am not discussing those exceptional details here. It is equally obvious that a Russian reactionary might cross the world with a vow of vengeance against the red flag, but that authoritarian might have some difficulties with the authorities if he shot a man for using the red flag on the railway between Willesden and Clapham Junction. But of course the difficulty about symbols is generally much more subtle than in these simple cases. I have remarked elsewhere that the first thing which a traveller should write about is the thing which he has not read about. It may be a small or a secondary thing, but it is a thing that he has seen and not merely expected to see. I gave the example of the great multitude of wooden houses in America. We might say of wooden towns and wooden cities. But after he has seen such things, his next duty is to see the meaning of them. And here a great deal of complication and controversy is possible. The thing probably does not mean what he first supposes it to mean on the face of it. But even on the face of it, it might mean many different and even opposite things. For instance, a wooden house might suggest an almost savage solitude, a rude shanty put together by a pioneer in a forest. Or it might mean a very recent and rapid solution of the housing problem, conducted cheaply and therefore on a very large scale. A wooden house might suggest the very newest thing in America, or one of the very oldest things in England. It might mean a grey ruin at Stratford, or a white exhibition at Earl's Court. It is when we come to this interpretation of international symbols that we make most of the international mistakes. Without the smallest error of detail, I will promise to prove that Oriental women are independent because they wear trousers, or Oriental men subject because they wear skirts. Merely to apply it to this case, I will take the example of two very commonplace and trivial objects of modern life, a walking stick and a fur coat. As it happened, I travelled about America with two sticks, like a Japanese nobleman with his two swords. I fear the simile is too stately. I bore more resemblance to a cripple with two crutches, or a highly ineffectual version of the devil on two sticks. I carried them both because I valued them both and did not wish to risk losing either of them in my erratic travels. One is a very plain grey stick from the woods of Buckinghamshire, but as I took it with me to Palestine, it partakes of the character of a pilgrim's staff. When I can say that I have taken the same stick to Jerusalem and to Chicago, I think the stick and I may both have a rest. The other, which I value even more, was given me by the Knights of Columbus at Yale, and I wish I could think that their chivalric title allowed me to regard it as a sword. Now I do not know whether the Americans I met, struck by the fastidious foppery of my dress and appearance, concluded that it is the custom of elegant English dandies to carry two walking sticks. But I do know that it is much less common among Americans than among Englishmen to carry even one. The point, however, is not merely that more sticks are carried by Englishmen than by Americans. It is that the sticks which are carried by Americans stand for something entirely different. In America, a stick is commonly called a cane, and it has about it something of the atmosphere which the poet described as the nice conduct of the clouded cane. It would be an exaggeration to say that when the citizens of the United States see a man carrying a light stick, they deduce that if he does that he does nothing else. But there is about it a faint flavour of luxury and lounging, and most of the energetic citizens of this energetic society avoid it by instinct. Now, in an Englishman like myself, carrying a stick may imply lounging, but it does not imply luxury, and I can say with some firmness that it does not imply dandyism. In a great many Englishmen it means the very opposite even of lounging. By one of those fantastic paradoxes which are the mystery of nationality, a walking stick often actually means walking. It frequently suggests the very reverse of the beau with his clouded cane. It does not suggest a town type, but rather specially a country type. It rather implies the kind of Englishman who tramps about in lanes and meadows and knocks the tops off thistles. It suggests the sort of man who has carried the stick through his native woods, and perhaps even cut it in his native woods. There are plenty of these vigorous loungers, no doubt, in the rural parts of America, but the idea of a walking stick would not especially suggest them to Americans. It would not call up such figures like a fairy wand. It would be easy to trace back the difference to many English origins, possibly to aristocratic origins, to the idea of the old squire, a man vigorous and even rustic, but trained to hold a useless staff rather than a useful tool. It might be suggested that American citizens do at least so far love freedom as to like to have their hands free. It might be suggested, on the other hand, that they keep their hands for the handles of many machines, and that the hand on a handle is less free than the hand on a stick or even a tool. But these again are controversial questions, and I am only noting a fact. If an Englishman wished to imagine more or less exactly what the impression is and how misleading it is, he could find something like a parallel in what he himself feels about a fur coat. When I first found myself among the crowds on the main floor of a New York hotel, my rather exaggerated impression of the luxury of the place was largely produced by the number of men in fur coats, and what we should consider rather ostentatious fur coats, with all the fur outside. Now, an Englishman has a number of atmospheric but largely accidental associations in connection with a fur coat. I will not say that he thinks a man in a fur coat must be wealthy and wicked man, but I do say that in his own ideal and perfect vision a wealthy and wicked man would wear a fur coat. Thus I had the sensation of standing in a surging mob of American millionaires, or even African millionaires, for the millionaires of Chicago must be like the Knights of the Round Table compared with the millionaires of Johannesburg. But as a matter of fact, the man in the fur coat was not even an American millionaire, but simply an American. It did not signify luxury, but rather necessity, and even a harsh and almost heroic necessity. Orson probably wore a fur coat, and he was brought up by bears, but not the bears of Wall Street. Eskimos are generally represented as furry folk, but they are not necessarily engaged in delicate financial operations, even in the typical and appropriate occupation called freezing out. And if the American is not exactly an Arctic traveller rushing from pole to pole, at least he is often literally fleeing from ice to ice. He has to make a very extreme distinction between outdoor and indoor clothing. He has to live in an ice house outside and a hot house inside, so hot that he may be said to construct an ice house inside that. He turns himself into an ice house and warms himself against the cold until he is warm enough to eat ices. But the point is that the same coat of fur which in England would indicate the sybarite life may here very well indicate the strenuous life, just as the same walking stick which would here suggest a lounger would in England suggest a plodder and almost a pilgrim. And these two trifles are types which I should like to put by way of proviso and apology at the very beginning of any attempt at a record of any impression of foreign society. They serve merely to illustrate the most important impression of all, the impression of how false all impressions may be. I suspect that most of the very false impressions have come from the careful record of very true facts. They have come from the fatal power of observing the facts without being able to observe the truth. They came from seeing the symbol with the most vivid clarity and being blind to all that it symbolises. It is as if a man who knew no Greek should imagine that he could read a Greek inscription because he took the Greek R for an English P, or the Greek long E for an English H. I do not mention this merely as a criticism on other people's impressions of America, but as a criticism on my own. I wish it to be understood that I am well aware that all my views are subject to this sort of potential criticism, and that even when I am certain of the facts, I do not profess to be certain of the deductions. In this chapter I hope to point out how a misunderstanding of this kind affects the common impression, not altogether unfounded, that the Americans talk about dollars. But for the moment I am merely anxious to avoid a similar misunderstanding when I talk about Americans, about the dogmas of democracy, about the right of a people to own its symbols, whether they be coins or customs. I am convinced, and no longer to be shaken. But about the meaning of those symbols, in silver or other substances, I am always open to correction. That error is the price we pay for the great glory of nationality, and in this sense I am quite ready at the start to warn my own readers against my own opinions. The fact without the truth is futile. Indeed, the fact without the truth is false. I have already noted that this is especially true touching our observations of a strange country, and it is certainly true touching one small fact which has swelled into a large fable. I mean the fable about America commonly summed up in the phrase about the almighty dollar. I do not think the dollar is almighty in America. I fancy many things are mightier, including many ideals, and some rather insane ideals. But I think it might be maintained that the dollar has another of the attributes of deity. If it is not omnipotent, it is in a sense omnipresent. Whatever Americans think about dollars, it is, I think, relatively true that they talk about dollars. If a mere mechanical record could be taken by the modern machinery of dictaphones and stenography, I do not think it probable that the mere word dollars would occur more often in any given number of American conversations than the mere word pounds or shillings in a similar number of English conversations. And these statistics, like nearly all statistics, would be utterly useless and even fundamentally false. It is as if we should calculate that the word elephant had been mentioned a certain number of times in a particular London street, or so many times more often than the word thunderbolt had been used in Stokes Pogues. Doubtless there are statisticians capable of collecting those statistics also, and doubtless there are scientific social reformers capable of legislating on the basis of them. They would probably argue from the elephantine imagery of the London street that such and such a percentage of the householders were megalomaniacs, and require medical care and police coercion. And doubtless their calculations, like nearly all such calculations, would leave out the only important point, as that street was in the immediate neighbourhood of the Zoo, or was yet more happily situated under the benignant shadow of the Elephant and Castle. And in the same way the mechanical calculation about the mention of dollars is entirely useless unless we have some moral understanding of why they are mentioned. It certainly does not mean merely a love of money, and if it did, a love of money may mean a great many very different and even contrary things. The love of money is very different in a peasant or in a pirate, in a miser or in a gambler, in a great financier or in a man doing some practical and productive work. Now this difference in the conversation of American and English business men arises, I think, from certain much deeper things in the American which are generally not understood by the Englishman. It also arises from much deeper things in the Englishman, of which the Englishman is even more ignorant. To begin with, I fancy that the American, quite apart from any love of money, has a great love of measurement. He will mention the exact size or weight of things in a way which appears to us as irrelevant. It is as if we were to say that a man came to see us carrying 3 feet of walking stick and 4 inches of cigar. It is so in cases that have no possible connection with any avarice or greed for gain. An American will praise the prodigal generosity of some other man in giving up his own estate for the good of the poor, but he will generally say that the philanthropist gave them a 200-acre park, where an Englishman would think it quite sufficient to say that he gave them a park. There is something about this precision which seems suitable to the American atmosphere, to the hard sunlight and the cloudless skies, and the glittering detail of the architecture and the landscape, just as the vaguer English version is consonant to our mistier and more impressionist scenery. It is also connected perhaps with something more boyish about the younger civilization, and corresponds to the passionate particularity with which a boy will distinguish the uniforms of regiments, the rigs of ships, or even the colours of tram tickets. It is a certain godlike appetite for things as distinct from thoughts. The end of section 13, chapter 7, part 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. What I Saw in America by G.K. Chesterton. Section 14, Chapter 7, Part 2. The American Businessman. But there is also, of course, a much deeper cause of the difference, and it can easily be deduced by noting the real nature of the difference itself. When 2 businessmen in a train are talking about dollars, I am not so foolish as to expect them to be talking about the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas. But if they were 2 English businessmen, I should not expect them to be talking about business. Probably it would be about some sport, and most probably some sport in which they themselves never dreamed of indulging. The approximate difference is that the American talks about his work and the Englishman about his holidays. His ideal is not labour but leisure. Like every other national characteristic, this is not primarily a point for praise or blame. In essence it involves neither, and in effect it involves both. It is certainly connected with that snobbishness which is the great sin of English society. The Englishman does love to conceive himself as a sort of country gentleman, and his castles in the air are all castles in Scotland rather than in Spain. For as an ideal, a Scotch castle is as English as a Welsh rarebit or an Irish stew. And if he talks less about money, I fear it is sometimes because, in one sense, he thinks more of it. Money is a mystery in the old and literal sense of something too sacred for speech. Gold is a god, and like the god of some agnostics, has no name and is worshipped only in his works. It is true in a sense that the English gentleman wishes to have enough money to be able to forget it. But it may be questioned whether he does entirely forget it. As against this weakness, the American has succeeded, at the price of a great deal of crudity and clatter, in making general a very real respect for work. He has partly disenchanted the dangerous glamour of the gentleman, and in that sense has achieved some degree of democracy, which is the most difficult achievement in the world. On the other hand, there is a good side to the Englishman's daydream of leisure, and one which the American spirit tends to miss. It may be expressed in the words holiday, or still better in the word hobby. The Englishman, in his character of Robin Hood, really has got 2 strings to his bow. Indeed, the Englishman really is well represented by Robin Hood, for there is always something about him that may literally be called outlawed, in the sense of being extra-legal or outside the rules. A Frenchman said of Browning that his centre was not in the middle, and it may be said of many an Englishman that his heart is not where his treasure is. Browning expressed a very English sentiment when he said, "I like to know a butcher paints, a baker rhymes for his pursuit, candlestick makers much acquaints, his soul with song or haply mute, blows out his brains upon the flute." Stevenson touched on the same insular sentiment when he said that many men he knew, who were meat salesmen to the outward eye, might in the life of contemplation sit with the saints. Now the extraordinary achievement of the American meat salesman is that his poetic enthusiasm can really be for meat sales, not for money, but for meat. An American commercial traveller asked me, with a religious fire in his eyes, whether I did not think that salesmanship could be an art. In England there are many salesmen who are sincerely fond of art, but seldom of the art of salesmanship. Art is with them a hobby, a thing of leisure and liberty. That is why the English traveller talks, if not of art, then of sport. That is why the two city men in the London train, if they are not talking about golf, may be talking about gardening. If they are not talking about dollars or the equivalent of dollars, the reason lies much deeper than any superficial praise or blame touching the desire for wealth. In the English case, at least, it lies very deep in the English spirit. Many of the greatest English things have had this lighter and looser character of a hobby or a holiday experiment. Even a masterpiece has often been a by-product. The works of Shakespeare come out so casually that they can be attributed to the most improbable people, even to Bacon. The sonnets of Shakespeare are picked up afterwards as if out of a waste-paper basket. The immortality of Dr. Johnson does not rest on the written leaves he collected, but entirely on the words he wasted, the words he scattered to the winds. So great a thing as Pickwick is almost a kind of accident. It began as something secondary and grew into something primary and preeminent. It began with mere words written to illustrate somebody else's pictures, and swelled like an epic expanded from an epigram. It might almost be said that in the case of Pickwick the author began as the servant of the artist. But as in the same story of Pickwick, the servant became greater than the master. This incalculable and accidental quality, like all national qualities, has its strength and weaknesses, but it does represent a certain reserve fund of interests in the Englishman's life, and distinguishes him from the other extreme type of the millionaire who works till he drops, or drops because he stops working. It is the great achievement of American civilization that in that country it really is not cant to talk about the dignity of labour. There is something that might almost be called the sanctity of labour. But it is subject to the profound law that when anything less than the highest becomes a sanctity, it tends also to become a superstition. When the candlestick maker does not blow out his brains upon the flute, there is always a danger that he may blow them out somewhere else, owing to depressed conditions in the candlestick market. Now, certainly one of the first impressions of America, or at any rate of New York, which is by no means the same thing as America, is that of a sort of mob of business men behaving in many ways in a fashion very different from that of swarms of London city men who go up every day to the city. They sit about in groups with red Indian gravity as if passing the pipe of peace, though in fact most of them are smoking cigars and some of them are eating cigars. The latter strikes me as one of the most peculiar of transatlantic tastes, more peculiar than that of chewing gum. A man will sit for hours consuming a cigar as if it were a sugar stick, but I should imagine it to be a very disagreeable sugar stick. Why he attempts to enjoy a cigar without lighting it I do not know. Whether it is a more economical way of carrying a mere symbol of commercial conversation, or whether something of the same queer outlandish morality that draws such a distinction between beer and ginger beer draws an equally ethical distinction between touching tobacco and lighting it. For the rest, it would be easy to make a mere external sketch full of things equally strange, for this can always be done in a strange country. I allow for the fact of all foreigners looking alike, but I fancy that all those hard-featured faces with spectacles and shaven jaws do rather look alike, because they all like to make their faces hard. And with the mention of their mental attitude we realize the futility of any such external sketch. Unless we can see that these are something more than men smoking cigars and talking about dollars, we had much better not see them at all. It is customary to condemn the American as a materialist because of his worship of success. But indeed this very worship, like any worship, even devil worship, proves him rather a mystic than a materialist. The Frenchman who retires from business when he has money enough to drink his wine and eat his omelette in peace might much more plausibly be called a materialist by those who do not prefer to call him a man of sense. But Americans do worship success in the abstract as a sort of ideal vision. They follow success rather than money. They follow money rather than meat and drink. If their national life in one sense is a perpetual game of poker, they are playing excitedly for chips or counters as well as for coins. And by the ultimate test of material enjoyment, like the enjoyment of an omelette, even a coin is itself a counter. The Yankee cannot eat chips as the Frenchman can eat chipped potatoes, but neither can he swallow red cents as the Frenchman swallows red wine. Thus when people say of a Yankee that he worships the dollar, they pay a compliment to his fine spirituality more true and delicate than they imagine. The dollar is an idol because it is an image, but it is an image of success and not of enjoyment. That this romance is also a religion is shown in the fact that there is a queer sort of morality attached to it. The nearest parallel to it is something like the sense of honour in the old duelling days. There is not a material, but a distinctly moral savour about the implied obligation to collect dollars or to collect chips. We hear too much in England of the phrase about making good, for no sensible Englishman favours the needless interlarding of English with scraps of foreign languages. But though it means nothing in English, it means something very particular in America. There is a fine shade of distinction between succeeding and making good, precisely because there must always be a sort of ethical echo in the word good. America does vaguely feel a man making good as something analogous to a man being good or a man doing good. It is connected with his serious self-respect and his sense of being worthy of those he loves. Nor is this curious, crude idealism wholly insincere, even when it drives him to what some of us would call stealing, any more than the duellist's honour was insincere when it drove him to what some would call murder. A very clever American play, which I once saw acted, contained a complete working model of this morality. A girl was loyal to, but distressed by, her engagement to a young man on whom there was a sort of cloud of humiliation. The atmosphere was exactly what it would have been in England if he had been accused of cowardice or card-sharping. And there was nothing whatever the matter with the poor young man except that some rotten mine or other in Arizona had not made good. Now in England we should either be below or above that ideal of good. If we were snobs, we should be content to know that he was a gentleman of good connections, perhaps too much accustomed to private means to be expected to be businesslike. If we were somewhat larger-minded people, we should know that he might be as wise as Socrates and as splendid as Bayard, and yet be unfitted. Perhaps one should say, therefore, be unfitted for the dismal and dirty gambling of modern commerce. But whether we were snobbish enough to admire him for being an idler, or chivalrous enough to admire him for being an outlaw, in neither case should we ever really, and in our hearts, despise him for being a failure. For it is this inner verdict of instinctive idealism that is the point at issue. Of course there is nothing new or peculiar to the New World about a man's engagement practically failing through his financial failure. An English girl might easily drop a man because he was poor, or she might stick to him faithfully and defiantly, though he was poor. The point is that this girl was faithful, but she was not defiant. That is, she was not proud. The whole psychology of the situation was that she shared the weird worldly idealism of her family, and it was wounded as her patriotism would have been wounded if he had betrayed his country. To do them justice, there was nothing to show that they would have had any real respect for a royal duke who had inherited millions. What the simple barbarians wanted was a man who could make good. that the process of making good would probably drag him through the mire of everything bad, that he would make good by bluffing, lying, swindling, and grinding the faces of the poor, did not seem to trouble them in the least. Against this fanaticism there is this shadow of truth, even in the fiction of aristocracy, that a gentleman may at least be allowed to be good, without being bothered to make it. Another objection to the phrase about the almighty dollar is that it is an almighty phrase, and therefore an almighty nuisance. I mean that it is made to explain everything, and to explain everything much too well. That is, much too easily. It does not really help people to understand a foreign country, but it gives them the fatal illusion that they do understand it. Dollars stood for America as frogs stood for France, because it was necessary to connect particular foreigners with something, or it would be so easy to confuse a Moor with a Montenegrin, or a Russian with a Red Indian. The only cure for this sort of satisfied familiarity is the shock of something really unfamiliar. When people can see nothing at all in American democracy except a Yankee running after a dollar, then the only thing to do is to trip them up as they run after the Yankee, or run away with their notion of the Yankee, by the obstacle of certain odd and obstinate facts that have no relation to that notion. And as a matter of fact, there are a number of such obstacles to any such generalization, a number of notable facts that have to be reconciled somehow to our previous notions. It does not matter for this purpose whether the facts are favourable or unfavourable, or whether the qualities are merits or defects, especially as we do not even understand them sufficiently to say which they are. The point is that we are brought to a pause and compelled to attempt to understand them rather better than we do. We have found one thing that we did not expect, and therefore the one thing that we cannot explain, and we are moved to an effort, probably an unsuccessful effort, to explain it. The end of section 14, chapter 7, part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. What I Saw in America by G.K. Chesterton. Section 15, Chapter 7, Part 3. The American Businessman. For instance, Americans are very unpunctual. That is the last thing that a critic expects who comes to condemn them for hustling and haggling and vulgar ambition. But it is almost the first fact that strikes the spectator on the spot. The chief difference between the humdrum English businessman and the hustling American businessman is that the hustling American businessman is always late. Of course, there is a great deal of difference between coming late and coming too late. But I noticed the fashion first in connection with my own lectures, touching which I could hardly recommend the habit of coming too late. I could easily understand a crowd of commercial Americans not coming to my lectures at all, but there was something odd about their coming in a crowd, and the crowd being expected to turn up some time after the appointed hour. The managers of these lectures, I continue to call them lectures out of courtesy to myself, often explained to me that it was quite useless to begin properly until about a half an hour after time. Often people were still coming in 3/4 of an hour or even an hour after time. Not that I objected to that, as some lecturers are said to do. It seemed to me an agreeable break in the monotony. But as a characteristic of a people mostly engaged in practical business, it struck me as curious and interesting. I have grown accustomed to being the most unbusinesslike person in any given company, and it gave me a sort of dizzy exultation to find I was not the most unpunctual person in that company. I was afterwards told by many Americans that my impression was quite correct, that American unpunctuality was really very prevalent and extended to much more important things. But at least I was not content to lump this along with all sorts of contrary things that I did not happen to like, and call it America. I am not sure of what it really means, But I rather fancy that, though it may seem the very reverse of the hustling, it has the same origin as the hustling. The American is not punctual because he is not punctilious. He is impulsive, and has an impulse to stay as well as an impulse to go. For after all, punctuality belongs to the same order of ideas as punctuation. And there is no punctuation in telegrams. The order of clocks and set hours which English business has always observed is a good thing in its own way. Indeed, I think that in a larger sense it is better than the other way. It is better because it is a protection against hustling, not a promotion of it. In other words, it is better because it is more civilized, as a great Venetian merchant prince clad in cloth of gold was more civilized, or an English merchant drinking in port in an oak-panelled room was more civilized, or a little French shopkeeper shutting up his shop to play dominoes is more civilized. And the reason is that the American has the romance of business and is monomaniac, while the Frenchman has the romance of life and is sane. But the romance of business really is a romance, and the Americans are really romantic about it. And that romance, though it revolves around pork or petrol, is really like a love affair in this, that it involves not only rushing but also lingering. The American is too busy to have any business habits. He is also too much in earnest to have any business rules. If we wish to understand him, we must compare him not with the French shopkeeper when he plays dominoes, but with the same French shopkeeper when he works the guns or mans the trenches as a conscript soldier. Everybody used to the punctilious Prussian standard of uniform and parade has noticed the roughness and apparent laxity of the French soldier, the looseness of his clothes, the unsightliness of his heavy knapsack, in short, his inferiority in every detail of the business of war, except fighting. There he is much too swift to be smart. He is much too practical to be precise. By a strange illusion which can lift pork packing almost to the level of patriotism, the American has the same free rhythm in his romance of business. He varies his conduct not to suit the clock but to suit the case. He gives more time to more important and less time to less important things, and he makes up his timetable as he goes along. Suppose he has 3 appointments. The first, let us say, is some mere trifle of erecting a tower 20 stories high and exhibiting a sky sign on the top of it. The second is a business discussion about the possibilities of printing advertisements of soft drinks on the table napkins at a restaurant. The third is attending a conference to decide how the populace can be prevented from using chewing gum, and the manufacturers can still manage to sell it. He will be content merely to glance at the sky sign as he goes by in a trolley car or an automobile. He will then settle down to the discussion with his partner about the table napkins, each speaker indulging in long monologues in turn, a peculiarity of much American conversation. Now, if in the middle of one of these monologues he suddenly thinks that the vacant space of the waiter's shirt front might also be utilized to advertise the Gee Whiz Ginger Champagne, he will instantly follow up the new idea in all its aspects and possibilities in an even longer monologue, and will never think of looking at his watch while he is rapturously looking at his waiter. The consequence is that he will come late into the great social movement against chewing gum, where an Englishman would probably have arrived at the proper hour. But though the Englishman's conduct is more proper, it need not be in all respects more practical. The Englishman's rules are better for that business of life, but not necessarily for the life of business. And it is true that for many of these Americans, business is the business of life. It is really also, as I have said, the romance of life. We shall admire or deplore this spirit accordingly as we are glad to see trade irradiated with so much poetry, or sorry to see so much poetry wasted on trade. But it does make many people happy, like any other hobby, and one is disposed to add that it does fill their imaginations like any other delusion. For the true criticism of all this commercial romance would involve a criticism of this historic phase of commerce. These people are building on the sand, though it shines like gold, and for them like fairy gold. But the world will remember the legend about fairy gold. Half the financial operations they follow deal with things that do not even exist. For in that sense, all finance is a fairy tale. Many of them are buying and selling things that do nothing but harm, but it does them good to buy and sell them. The claim of the romantic salesman is better justified than he realizes. Business really is romance, for it is not reality. There is one real advantage that America has over England, largely due to its livelier and more impressionable ideal. America does not think that stupidity is practical. It does not think that ideas are merely destructive things. It does not think that a genius is only a person to be told to go away and blow his brains out. Rather, it would open all its machinery to the genius and beg him to blow his brains in. It might attempt to use a natural force like Blake or Shelley for the very ignoble purpose. It would be quite capable of asking Blake to take Tiger and his golden lions round as a sort of Barnum show, or Shelley to hang his stars and haloed clouds among the lights of Broadway. But it would not assume that a natural force is useless any more than that Niagara is useless. And there is a very definite distinction here touching the intelligence of the trader, whatever we may think of either course touching the intelligence of the artist. It is one thing that Apollo should be employed by Admetus, though he is a god. It is quite another thing that Apollo should always be sacked by Admetus, because he is a god. Now in England, largely owing to the accident of a rivalry and therefore a comparison with France, there arose about the end of the 18th century an extraordinary notion that there was some sort of connection between dullness and success. What the Americans call a bonehead became what the English call a hard-headed man. The merchants of London evinced their contempt for the fantastic logicians of Paris by living in a permanent state of terror lest somebody should set the Thames on fire. In this, as in much else, it is much easier to understand the Americans if we connect them with the French, who were their allies, than with the English, who were their enemies. There are a great many Franco-American resemblances, which the practical Anglo-Saxons are, of course, too hard-headed or bone-headed to see. American history is haunted with the shadow of the plebiscitary president. They have a tradition of classical architecture for public buildings. Their cities are planned upon the squares of Paris and not upon the labyrinth of London. They call their cities Corinth and Syracuse, as the French called their citizens Epaminondas and Timoleon. Their soldiers wore the French kepi, and they make coffee admirably and do not make tea at all. But of all the French elements in America, the most French is this real practicality. They know that at certain times the most businesslike of all quality is a French phrase. The publisher may induce the poet to do a pot boiler, but the publisher would cheerfully allow the poet to set the Mississippi on fire if it would boil his particular pot. It is not so much that Englishmen are stupid as that they are afraid of being clever. And it is not so much that Americans are clever as they do not try to be any stupider than they are. The fire of French logic has burnt that out of America as it has burned it out of Europe, and of almost every place except England. This is one of the few points on which English insularity really is a disadvantage. It is the fatal notion that the only sort of common sense is to be found in compromise, and that the only sort of compromise is to be found in confusion. This must be clearly distinguished from the commonplace about the utilitarian world not rising to the invisible values of genius. Under this philosophy, the utilitarian does not see the utility of genius, even when it is quite visible. He does not see it, not because he is a utilitarian, but because he is an idealist whose ideal is dullness. For some time the English aspired to be stupid, prayed and hoped with soaring spiritual ambition to be stupid. But with all their worship of success, they did not succeed in being stupid. The natural talents of a great and traditional nation were always breaking out in spite of them. In spite of the merchants of London, Turner did set the Thames on fire. In spite of our previously explained preference for realism to romance, Europe persisted in resounding with the name of Byron. And just when we had made it perfectly clear to the French that we despised all their flamboyant tricks, that we were a plain, prosaic people, and there was no fantastic glory or chivalry about us, the very shaft we sent against them shone with the name of Nelson, a shooting and a falling star. The end of section 15. The end of chapter 7. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. What I Saw in America by G.K. Chesterton. Section 16, Chapter 8, Part 1, Presidents and Problems. All good Americans wish to fight the representatives they have chosen. All good Englishmen wish to forget the representatives they have chosen. This difference, deep and perhaps ineradicable in the temperaments of the two peoples, explains 1,000 things in their literature and their laws. The American national poet praised his people for their readiness to rise against the never-ending audacity of elected persons. The English national anthem is content to say heartily but almost hastily, "Confound their politics," and then more cheerfully, as if changing the subject, "God save the King." For this is especially the secret of the monarch or the chief magistrate in the two countries. They arm the President with the powers of a king that he may be a nuisance in politics. We deprive the king even of the powers of a president, lest he should remind us of a politician. We desire to forget the never-ending audacity of elected persons, and with us, therefore, it really never does end. That is the practical objection to our own habit of changing the subject instead of changing the ministry. The king, as the Irish wit observed, is not a subject, but in that sense the English crowned head is not a king. He is a popular figure intended to remind us of the England that politicians do not remember, the England of horses and ships and gardens and good fellowship. The Americans have no such purely social symbol, and it is rather the root than the result of this that their social luxury, and especially their sports, are a little lacking in humanity and humour. It is the American, much more than the Englishman, who takes his pleasure sadly, not to say savagely. The genuine popularity of constitutional monarchs in parliamentary countries can be explained by any practical example. Let us suppose that great social reform, the Compulsory Hair-Cutting Act, has just begun to be enforced. The Compulsory Hair-Cutting Act, as every good citizen knows, is a statute which permits any person to grow his hair to any length and any wild or wonderful shape, so long as he is registered with the hairdresser, who charges a shilling. But it imposes a universal close shave, like that which is found so hygienic during a curative detention at Dartmoor, on all who are registered only with a barber, who charges 3d. Thus, while the ornamental classes can continue to ornament the street with Piccadilly weepers or chin beards if they choose, the working classes demonstrate the care with which the state protects them by going about in a fresher, cooler and cleaner condition, a condition which has the further advantage of revealing at a glance that outline of the criminal skull which is so common among them. The Compulsory Hair-Cutting Act is thus in every way a compact and convenient example of all our current laws about education, sport, liquor and liberty in general. While the law is passed and the masses, insensible to its scientific value, are still murmuring against it, the ignorant peasant maiden is averse to so extreme a fashion of bobbing her hair, and does not see how she can even be a flapper with nothing to flap. Her father, his mind already poisoned by Bolshevists, begins to wonder who the devil does these things, and why. In proportion as he knows the world of today, he guesses that the real origin may be quite obscure, or the real motive quite corrupt. The pressure may have come from anybody who has gained power or money anyhow. It may have come from the foreign millionaire who owns all the expensive hairdressing saloons. It may have come from some swindler in the cutlery trade who has contracted to sell 1,000,000 bad razors. Hence the poor man looks about him with suspicion in the street, knowing that the lowest sneak or the loudest snob he sees may be directing the government of his country. Anybody may have to do with politics, and this sort of thing is politics. Suddenly he catches sight of a crowd, stops, and begins wildly to cheer a carriage that is passing. The carriage contains the one person who has certainly not originated any great scientific reform. He is the only person in the Commonwealth who is not allowed to cut off other people's hair, or to take away other people's liberties. He at least is kept out of politics, and men hold him up as they did an unspotted victim to appease the wrath of the gods. He is their king, and the only man they know is not their ruler. We need not be surprised that he is popular, knowing how they are ruled. The popularity of a president in America is exactly the opposite. The American Republic is the last medieval monarchy. It is intended that the president shall rule, and take all the risks of ruling. If the hair is cut, he is the hair cutter, the magistrate that bears not the razor in vain. All the popular presidents, Jackson and Lincoln and Roosevelt, have acted as democratic despots, but emphatically not as constitutional monarchs. In short, the names have become curiously interchanged, and as a historical reality it is the president who ought to be called the king. But it is not only true that the president could correctly be called the king. It is also true that the king might correctly be called the president. We could hardly find a more exact description of him than to call him a president. What is expected in modern times of a modern constitutional monarch is emphatically that he should preside. We expect him to take the throne exactly as if he were taking the chair. The chairman does not move the motion or resolution, far less vote it. He is not supposed even to favour it. He is expected to please everybody by favouring nobody. The primary essentials of a president or chairman are that he should be treated with ceremonial respect, that he should be popular in his personality and yet impersonal in his opinions, and that he should actually be a link between all the other persons by being different from all of them. This is exactly what is demanded of the constitutional monarch in modern times. It is exactly the opposite to the American position, in which the president does not preside at all. He moves, and the things he moves may truly be called a motion, for the national idea is perpetual motion. Technically it is called a message, and might often be called a menace. Thus we may truly say that the king presides and the president reigns. Some would prefer to say that the president rules, and some senators and members of Congress would prefer to say that he rebels. But there is no doubt that he moves. He does not take the chair or even the stool, but rather the stump. Some people seem to suppose that the fall of President Wilson was a denial of this almost despotic ideal in America. As a matter of fact, it was the strongest possible assertion of it. The idea is that the president shall take responsibility and risk, and responsibility means being blamed, and risk means the risk of being blamed. The theory is that the things are done by the president, and if things go wrong, or are alleged to go wrong, it is the fault of the president. This does not invalidate, but rather ratifies the comparison with true monarchs, such as the medieval monarchs. Constitutional princes are seldom deposed, but despots were often deposed. In the simpler races of sunnier lands, such as Turkey, they were commonly assassinated. Even in our own history, a king often received the same respectful tribute to the responsibility and reality of his office. But King John was attacked because he was strong, not because he was weak. Richard II lost the crown because the crown was a trophy, not because it was a trifle. And President Wilson was deposed because he had used a power which is such in its nature that a man must use it at the risk of deposition. As a matter of fact, of course, it is easy to exaggerate Mr. Wilson's real unpopularity, and still more easy to exaggerate Mr. Wilson's real failure. There are a great many people in America who justify and applaud him, and what is yet more interesting, who justify him not on pacifist and idealistic, but on patriotic and even military grounds. It is especially insisted by some that his demonstration, which seemed futile as a threat against Mexico, was a very far-sighted preparation for the real threat against Prussia. But in so far as the democracy did disagree with him, it was but the occasional and inevitable result of the theory by which the despot has to anticipate the democracy. Thus the American king and the English president are the very opposite of each other, yet they are both the varied and very national indications of the same contemporary truth. It is the great weariness and contempt that have fallen upon common politics in both countries. It may be answered with some show of truth that the new American president represents a return to common politics, and that in that sense he marks a real rebuke to the last president and his more uncommon politics. And it is true that many who put Mr. Harding in power regard him as the symbol of something which they call normalcy, which may roughly be translated into English by the word normality. And by this they do mean, more or less, the return to the vague capitalist conservatism of the 19th century. They might call Mr. Harding a Victorian if they had ever lived under Victoria. Perhaps these people do entertain the extraordinary notion that the 19th century was normal. But there are very few who think so, and even they will not think so long. The blunder is the beginning of nearly all our present troubles. The 19th century was the very reverse of normal. It suffered a most unnatural strain in the combination of political equality in theory with extreme economic inequality in practice. Capitalism was not normalcy, but an abnormalcy. Property is normal, and is more normal in proportion as it is universal. Slavery may be normal and even natural in the sense that a bad habit may be second nature. But capitalism was never anything so human as a habit. We may say it was never anything so good as a bad habit. It was never a custom, for men never grew accustomed to it. It was never even conservative, for before it was even created, wise men had realized that it could not be conserved. It was from the first a problem, and those who will not even admit the capitalist problem deserve to get the Bolshevist solution. All things considered, I cannot say anything worse of them than that. The end of section 16, chapter 8, part 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. What I Saw in America by G.K. Chesterton. Section 17, Chapter 8, Part 2, Presidents and Problems. The recent presidential election preserves some trace of the old party system of America, but its tradition has very nearly faded like that of the party system of England. It is easy for an Englishman to confess that he never quite understood the American party system. It would perhaps be more courageous in him and more informing to confess that he never really understood the British party system. The planks in the two American platforms may easily be exhibited as very disconnected and ramshackle. But our own party was as much of a patchwork, and indeed, I think, even more so. Everybody knows that the two American factions were called Democrat and Republican. It does not at all cover the case to identify the former with Liberals and the latter with Conservatives. The Democrats are the party of the South, and have some true tradition from the Southern aristocracy and the defense of secession and states' rights. The Republicans rose in the North as the party of Lincoln, largely condemning slavery. But the Republicans are also the party of tariffs, and are at least accused of being the party of trusts. The Democrats are the party of free trade, and in the great movement of 20 years ago, the party of free silver. The Democrats are also the party of the Irish, and the stones they throw at trusts are retorted by stones thrown at Tammany. It is easy to see all these things as curiously sporadic and bewildering, but I am inclined to think that they are as a whole more coherent and rational than our own old division of Liberals and Conservatives. There is even more doubt nowadays about what is the connecting link between the different terms in the old British party programmes. I have never been able to understand why being in favour of protection should have anything to do with being opposed to Home Rule, especially as most of the people who were to receive Home Rule were themselves in favour of protection. I could never see what giving people cheap bread had to do with forbidding them cheap beer, or why the party which sympathises with Ireland cannot sympathise with Poland. I cannot see why Liberals did not liberate public houses, or Conservatives conserve crofters. I do not understand the principle upon which the causes were selected on both sides, and I incline to think that it was with the impartial object of distributing nonsense equally on both sides. Heaven knows there is enough nonsense in American politics too, towering and tropical nonsense like a cyclone or an earthquake. But when all is said, I incline to think that there was more spiritual and atmospheric cohesion in the different parts of the American party than in those of the English party, and I think this unity was all the more real because it was more difficult to define. The Republican party originally stood for the triumph of the North, and the North stood for the 19th century, that is, for the characteristic commercial expansion of the 19th century, for a firm faith in the profit and progress of its great and growing cities, its division of labour, its industrial science, and its evolutionary reform. The Democratic party stood more loosely for all the elements that doubted whether this development was democratic or was desirable. All that looked back to Jeffersonian idealism and the serene abstractions of the 18th century, or forward to Bryanite idealism and some simplified utopia founded on grain rather than gold. Along with this went, not at all unnaturally, the last and lingering sentiment of the Southern squires, who remembered a more rural civilization that seemed by comparison romantic. Along with this went quite logically the passions and the pathos of the Irish, themselves a rural civilization whose basis is a religion, or what the 19th century tended to call superstition. Above all, it was perfectly natural that this tone of thought should favour local liberties, and even a revolt on behalf of local liberties, and should distrust the huge machine of centralised power called the Union. In short, something very near the truth was said by a suicidally silly Republican orator who was running Blaine for the presidency, when he denounced the Democratic Party as supported by Rome, rum, and rebellion. They seem to me to be three excellent things in their place, and that is why I suspect that I should have belonged to the Democratic Party if I had been born in America when there was a Democratic Party. But I fancy that by this time even this general distinction has become very dim. If I had been an American 20 years ago, in the time of the great Free Silver campaign, I should certainly never have hesitated for an instant about my sympathies or my side. My feelings would have been exactly those that are nobly expressed by Mr. Vachell Lindsay in a poem bearing the characteristic title of Bryan, 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 Bryan. And, by the way, nobody can begin to sympathise with America whose soul does not to some extent begin to swing and dance to the drums and gongs of Mr. Vachell Lindsay's great orchestra, which has the note of his whole nation in this. Yet a refined person can revile it 100 times over as violent and brazen and barbarous and absurd, but not as insincere. There is something in it, and that something is the soul of many million men. But the poet himself, in the political poem referred to, speaks of Bryan's fall over free silver as defeat of my boyhood, defeat of my dream, and it is only too probable that the cause has fallen as well as the candidate. The William Jennings Bryan of later years is not the man whom I should have seen in my youth, with the visionary eyes of Mr. Vachell Lindsay. He has become a commonplace pacifist, which is in its nature the very opposite of a revolutionist. For if men will fight rather than sacrifice humanity on a golden cross, it cannot be wrong for them to resist its being sacrificed to an iron cross. I came into very indirect contact with Mr. Bryan when I was in America, in a fashion that made me realize how hard it has become to recover the illusions of a Bryanite. I believe that my lecture agent was anxious to arrange a debate, and I threw out a sort of loose challenge to the effect that woman's suffrage had weakened the position of woman. And while I was away in the wilds of Oklahoma, my lecture agent, a man of blood-curdling courage and enterprise, asked Mr. Bryan to debate with me. Now, Mr. Bryan is one of the greatest orators of modern history, and there is no conceivable reason why he should trouble to debate with a wandering lecturer. But as a matter of fact, he expressed himself in the most magnanimous and courteous terms about my personal position, but said, as I understood, that it would be improper to debate on female suffrage, as it was already part of the political system. And when I heard that, I could not help a sigh, for I recognized something I knew only too well on the front benches of my own beloved land. The great and glorious demagogue had degenerated into a statesman. I had never expected for a moment that the great orator could be bothered to debate with me at all. But it had never occurred to me, as a general moral principle, that two educated men were forever forbidden to talk sense about a particular topic, because a lot of other people had already voted on it. What is the matter with that attitude is the loss of the freedom of the mind. There can be no liberty of thought unless it is ready to unsettle what has recently been settled, as well as what has long been settled. We are perpetually being told in the papers that what is wanted is a strong man who will do things. What is wanted is a strong man who will undo things. And that will be a real test of strength. Anyhow, we could have believed in the time of free silver fight that the Democratic Party was democratic with a small d. In Mr. Wilson it was transfigured, his friends would say into a higher, and his foes into a hazier thing. And the Republican reaction against him, even where it has been healthy, has also been hazy. In fact, it has been not so much the victory of a political party as a relapse into repose after certain political passions. And in that sense there is a truth in the strange phrase about normalcy, in the sense that there is nothing more normal than going to sleep. But an even larger truth is this: it is most likely that America is no longer concentrated upon these faction fights at all, but is considering certain large problems upon which those factions hardly trouble to take sides. They are too large even to be classified as foreign policy distinct from domestic policy. They are so large as to be inside as well as outside the state. From an English standpoint, the most obvious example is the Irish. For the Irish problem is not a British problem, but also an American problem. And this is true even of the great external enigma of Japan. The Japanese question may be a part of foreign policy for America, but it is a part of domestic policy for California. And the same is true of that other intense and intelligent Eastern people, the genius and limitations of which have troubled the world so much longer. What the Japanese are in California, the Jews are in America. That is, they are a piece of a foreign policy that has become embedded in domestic policy, something which is found inside but still has to be regarded from the outside. On these great international matters, I doubt if Americans got much guidance from their party system, especially as most of these questions have grown very recently and rapidly to enormous size. Men are left free to judge of them with fresh minds. And that is the truth of the statement that the Washington Conference has opened the gates of a new world. On the relations to England and Ireland I will not attempt to dwell adequately here. I have already noted that my first interview was with an Irishman, and my first impression from that interview a vivid sense of the importance of Ireland in Anglo-American relations. And I have said something of the Irish problem, prematurely and out of its proper order, under the stress of that sense of urgency. Here I will only add two remarks about the two countries respectively. A great many British journalists have recently imagined that they were pouring oil upon the troubled waters, when they were rather pouring out oil to smooth the downward path, and to turn the broad road to destruction into a butter slide. They seem to have no notion of what to do, except to say what they imagine the very stupidest of their readers would be pleased to hear, and conceal whatever the most intelligent of their readers would probably like to know. They therefore informed the public that the majority of Americans had abandoned all sympathy with Ireland because of its alleged sympathy with Germany, and that this majority of Americans was now ardently in sympathy with its English brothers across the sea. Now, to begin with, such critics have no notion of what they are saying when they talk about the majority of Americans. To anybody who has happened to look in, let us say, on the city of Omaha, Nebraska, the remark will have something enormous and overwhelming about it. It's like saying that the majority of the inhabitants of China would agree with the Chinese ambassador in a preference for dining at the Savoy rather than the Ritz. There are millions and millions of people living in those great central plains of the North American continent, of whom it would be nearer the truth to say that they have never heard of England, or of Ireland either, than to say that their first emotional movement is a desire to come to the rescue of either of them. It is perfectly true that the more monomaniac sort of Sinn Feiner might sometimes irritate this innocent and isolated American spirit by being pro-Irish. It is equally true that a traditional Bostonian or Virginian might irritate it by being pro-English. The only difference is that large numbers of pure Irishmen are scattered in those far places, and large numbers of pure Englishmen are not. But it is truest of all to say that neither England nor Ireland so much as crosses the mind of most of them once in 6 months. Painting up large notices of "Watch Us Grow," making money by farming with machinery, together with an occasional hold-up with 6-shooters and photographs of a beautiful murderess or divorcee, fill up the round of their good and happy lives, and fleet the time carelessly as in the Golden Age. The end of section 17, chapter 8, part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. What I Saw in America by G.K. Chesterton. Section 18, Chapter 8, Part 3, Presidents and Problems. But putting aside all this vast and distant democracy which is the real majority of Americans, and confining ourselves to that older culture on the eastern coast which the critics probably had in mind, we shall find the case more comforting, but not to be covered with cheap and false comfort. Now it is perfectly true that any Englishman coming to this eastern coast, as I did, finds himself not only most warmly welcomed as a guest, but most cordially complimented as an Englishman. Men recall with pride the branches of their family that belong to England, or the English counties where they were rooted. And there are enthusiasms for English literature and history which are as spontaneous as patriotism itself. Something of this may be put down to certain promptitude and flexibility in all American kindness, which is never sufficiently stodgy to be called good nature. The Englishman does sometimes wonder whether, if he had been a Russian, his hosts would not have remembered remote Russian aunts and uncles and disinterred a Muscovite great-grandmother, or whether, if he had come from Iceland, they would not have known as much about Iceland's sagas and been as sympathetic about the absence of Icelandic snakes. But with a fair review of the proportions of the case, he will dismiss this conjecture and come to the conclusion that a number of educated Americans are very warmly and sincerely sympathetic with England. What I began to feel with a certain creeping chill was that they were only too sympathetic with England. The word sympathetic has sometimes rather a double sense. The impression I received was that all these chivalrous Southerners and men mellow with Bostonian memories were rallying to England, and they were on the defensive, and it was poor old England that they were defending. Their attitude implied that somebody or something was leaving her undefended or finding her indefensible. The burden of that hearty chorus was that England was not so black as she was painted. It seemed clear that somewhere or other she was being painted pretty black. But there was something else that made me uncomfortable. It was not only the sense of being somewhat boisterously forgiven, it was also something involving questions of power as well as morality. Then it seemed to me that a new sensation turned me hot and cold, and I felt something I have never before felt in a foreign land. Never had my father or my grandfather known that sensation. Never during the great and complex and perhaps perilous expansion of our power and commerce in the last 100 years had an Englishman heard exactly that note in a human voice. England was being pitied. I, as an Englishman, was not only being pardoned, but pitied. My country was beginning to be an object of compassion like Poland or Spain. My first emotion, full of the mood and movement of 100 years, was one of furious anger. But the anger has given place to anxiety, and the anxiety is not yet at an end. It is not my business here to expound my view of English politics, still less of European politics or the politics of the world, but to put down a few impressions of American travel. On many points of European politics the impression will be purely negative. I am sure that most Americans have no notion of the position of France or the position of Poland. But if English readers want the truth, I am sure this is the truth about their notion of the position of England. They are wondering, or those who are watching are wondering, whether the term of her success is come and she is going down the dark road after Prussia. Many are sorry if this is so, some are glad if it is so, but all are seriously considering the probability of its being so. And herein lay especially the horrible folly of our black and tan terrorism over the Irish people. I have noted that the newspapers told us that America had been chilled in its Irish sympathies by Irish detachment during the war. It is the painful truth that any advantage we might have had from this we ourselves immediately proceed to destroy. Ireland might have put herself wrong with America by her attitude about Belgium, if England had not instantly proceeded to put herself more wrong by her attitude towards Ireland. It is quite true that two blacks do not make a white, but you cannot send a black to reproach people with tolerating blackness. And this is quite as true when one is a black Brunswicker and the other a black and tan. It is true that since then England has made surprisingly sweeping concessions so large as to increase the amazement that the refusal should have been so long. But unfortunately the combination of the two rather clinches the conception of our decline. If the concession had come before the terror, it would have looked like an attempt to emancipate, and would probably have succeeded. Coming so abruptly after the terror, it looked only like an attempt to tyrannize, and an attempt that failed. It was partly an inheritance from a stupid tradition, which tried to combine what is called firmness with what is called conciliation, as if when we made up our minds to soothe a man with a £5 note, we always took care to undo our own action by giving him a kick as well. The English politician has often done that. though there's nothing to be said of such a fool except that he has wasted a fiver. But in this case he gave the kick first, received a kicking in return, and then gave up the money. And it was hard for the bystanders to say anything except that he had been badly beaten. The combination and sequence of events seems almost as if it were arranged to suggest the dark and ominous parallel. The first action looked only too like the invasion of Belgium, and the second like the evacuation of Belgium. So that vast and silent crowd in the West looked at British Empire as men look at a great tower that has begun to lean. Thus it was that while I found real pleasure, I could not find unrelieved consolation in the sincere compliments paid to my country by so many cultivated Americans. Their memories of homely corners of historic counties from which their fathers came, of the cathedral that dwarfs the town, or the inn at the turning of the road, there was something in their voices and look in their eyes which from the first disturbed me. So I have heard good Englishmen, who died afterwards the death of soldiers, cry aloud in 1914, "It seems impossible of those jolly Bavarians," or I will never believe it when I think of the time I had at Heidelberg. But there are other things beside the parallel of Prussia or the problem of Ireland. The American press is much freer than our own. The American public is much more familiar with the discussion of corruption than our own, and it is much more conscious of the corruption of our politics than we are. Almost any man in America may speak of the Marconi case. Many a man in England does not even know what it means. Many imagine that it had something to do with the propriety of politicians speculating on the stock exchange, so that it means a great deal to Americans to say that one figure in that drama is ruling India and another is ruling Palestine. And this brings me to another problem, which is dealt with much more openly in America than in England. I mention it here only because it is a perfect model of the misunderstandings in the modern world. If anyone asks for an example of exactly how the important part of every story is left out, and even the part that is reported is not understood, he could hardly have a stronger case than the story of Henry Ford of Detroit. When I was in Detroit, I had the pleasure of meeting Mr. Ford, and it really was a pleasure. He is a man quite capable of views which I think silly to the point of insanity, but he is not the vulgar benevolent boss. It must be admitted that he is a millionaire, but he cannot really be convicted of being a philanthropist. He is not a man who merely wants to run people. It is rather his views that run him and perhaps run away with him. He has a distinguished and sensitive face. He really invented things himself, unlike most men who profit by inventions. He is something of an artist and not a little of a fighter. A man of that type is always capable of being wildly wrong, especially in the sectarian atmosphere of America. And Mr. Ford has been wrong before and may be wrong now. He is chiefly known in England for a project which I think very preposterous, that of the peace ship, which came to Europe during the war. But he is not known in England at all in connection with a much more important campaign, which he has conducted much more recently and with much more success, a campaign against the Jews, like one of the anti-Semitic campaigns of the continent. Now, anyone who knows anything of America knows exactly what the peace ship would be like. It was a national combination of imagination and ignorance, which has at least some of the beauty of innocence. Men living in those huge, hedgeless inland plains know nothing about frontiers or the tragedy of a fight for freedom. They know nothing of alarm and armaments or the peril of a high civilization poised like a precious statue within reach of a mailed fist. They are accustomed to a cosmopolitan citizenship in which men of all bloods mingle, and in which men of all creeds are counted equal. Their highest moral boast is humanitarianism. Their highest mental boast is enlightenment. In a word, they are the very last men in the world who would seem likely to pride themselves on a prejudice against the Jews. They have no religion in particular, except a sincere sentiment which they would call true Christianity, and which specially forbids an attack on the Jews. They have a patriotism which prides itself on assimilating all types, including the Jews. Mr. Ford is a pure product of this pacific world, and was sufficiently proved by his pacifism. If a man of that sort has discovered that there is a Jewish problem, it is because there is a Jewish problem. It is certainly not because there is an anti-Jewish prejudice. For if there had been any amount of such racial and religious prejudice, he would have been about the very last sort of man to have it. His particular part of the world would have been the very last place to produce it. We may well laugh at the peace ship and its wild course and inevitable shipwreck, but remember that its very wildness was an attempt to sail as far as possible from the castle of Front-de-Bœuf. Everything that made him anti-war should have prevented him from being anti-Semite. We may mock him for being mad on peace, but we cannot say that he was so mad on peace that he made war on Israel. It happened that when I was in America, I had just published some studies on Palestine, and I was besieged by rabbis lamenting my prejudice. I pointed out that they would have got hold of the wrong word, even if they had not got hold of the wrong man. As a point of personal autobiography, I do not happen to be a man who dislikes Jews, though I believe that some men do. I have had Jews among my most intimate and faithful friends since my boyhood, and I hope to have them till I die. But even if I did have a dislike of Jews, it would be illogical to call that dislike a prejudice. Prejudice is a very lucid Latin word, meaning the bias which a man has before he considers a case. I might be said to be prejudiced against a hairy Anu because of his name, for I have never been on terms of such intimacy with him as to correct my preconceptions. But if, after moving about in a modern world and meeting Jews, knowing Jews, doing business with Jews, and reading and hearing about Jews, I came to the conclusion that I did not like Jews, my conclusion certainly would not be a prejudice. It would simply be an opinion, and one I should be perfectly entitled to hold, though as a matter of fact I do not hold it. No extravagance of hatred, merely following an experience of Jews, can properly be called a prejudice. Now the point is that this new American anti-Semitism springs from experience, and nothing but experience. There is no prejudice for it to spring from, or rather the prejudice is all the other way. All the traditions of that democracy, and very creditable traditions too, are in favour of toleration and a sort of idealistic indifference. The sympathies in which these 19th century people were reared were all against Front-de-Bœuf and in favour of Rebecca. They inherited a prejudice against anti-Semitism, a prejudice of anti-Semitism. These people of the plains have found the Jewish problem exactly as they might have struck oil, because it is there, and not even because they were looking for it. Their view of the problem, like their use of the oil, is not always satisfactory, and with parts of it I entirely disagree. But the point is that the thing which I call a problem, and others call a prejudice, has now appeared in broad daylight in a new country, where there is no priestcraft, no feudalism, no ancient superstition to explain it. It has appeared because it is a problem, and those are the best friends of the Jews, including many of the Jews themselves, who are trying to find a solution. That is the meaning of the incident of Mr. Henry Ford of Detroit, and you will hardly hear an intelligible word about it in England. The talk of prejudice against the Japanese is not unlike the talk of prejudice against the Jews, only in this case our indifference is really the excuse of ignorance. We used to lecture the Russians for oppressing the Jews, before we heard the word Bolshevist and began to lecture them for being oppressed by the Jews. In the same way we have long lectured the Californians for oppressing the Japanese, without allowing for the possibility of their foreseeing that the oppression may soon be the other way. As in the other case, it may be a persecution, but it is not a prejudice. The Californians know more about the Japanese than we do, and our own colonists, when they are placed in the same position, generally say the same thing. I will not attempt to deal adequately here with the vast international and diplomatic problems which arise with the name of the new power in the Far East. It is possible that Japan, having imitated European militarism, may imitate European pacifism. I cannot honestly pretend to know what the Japanese mean by the one any more than by the other. But when Englishmen, especially English Liberals like myself, take a superior and censorious attitude towards Americans, and especially Californians, I am moved to make a final remark. When a considerable number of Englishmen talk of the grave contending claims of our friendship with Japan and our friendship with America, when they finally tend in a sort of summing up to dwell on the superior virtues of Japan, I may be permitted to make a single comment. We are perpetually boring the world and each other with talk about the bonds that bind us to America. We are perpetually crying aloud that England and America are very much alike, especially England. We are always insisting that the two are identical in all things in which they most obviously differ. We are always saying that they both stand for democracy, when we should not consent to stand their democracy for half a day. We are always saying that at least we are all Anglo-Saxons, when we are descended from Romans and Normans and Britons and Danes, and they are descended from Irishmen and Italians and Slavs and Germans. We tell a people whose very existence is a revolt against the British Crown that they are passionately devoted to the British Constitution. We tell a nation whose whole policy has been isolation and independence that with us she can bear safely the white man's burden of the universal empire. We tell a continent crowded with Irishmen to thank God that the Saxon can always rule the Celt. We tell a populace whose very virtues are lawless that together we uphold the reign of law. We recognize our own law-abiding character in people who make laws that neither they nor anybody else can abide. We congratulate them on clinging to all they have cast away, and on imitating everything which they came into existence to insult. And when we have established all these nonsensical analogies with a non-existent nation, we wait until there is a crisis in which we really are at one with America, and then we falter and threaten to fail her. In a battle where we really are of one blood, the blood of the great white race throughout the world, when we really have one language, the fundamental alphabet of Cadmus and the script of Rome, when we really do represent the same reign of law, the common conscience of Christendom and the morals of men baptized, when we really have an implicit faith and honour and type of freedom to summon up our souls as with trumpets, then many of us begin to weaken and waver and wonder whether there is not something very nice about little yellow men whose heroic stories revolve around polygamy and suicide, and whose heroes wore 2 swords and worshipped the ancestors of the Mikado. The end of section 18. The end of chapter 8. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. What I Saw in America by G.K. Chesterton. Section 19, Chapter 9, Part 1, Prohibition in Fact and Fancy. I went to America with some notion of not discussing prohibition, but I soon found that well-to-do Americans were only too delighted to discuss it over the nuts and wine. They were even willing, if necessary, to dispense with the nuts. I am far from sneering at this, having a general philosophy which need not here be expounded, but which may be symbolized by saying that monkeys can enjoy nuts, but only men can enjoy wine. But if I'm to deal with prohibition, there's no doubt of the first thing to be said about it. The first thing to be said about it is that it does not exist. It is to some extent enforced among the poor. At any rate, it was intended to be enforced among the poor, even though among them, I fancy, it is much evaded. It is certainly not enforced among the rich, and I doubt whether it was intended to be. I suspect that this has always happened whenever this negative notion has taken hold of some particular province or tribe. Prohibition never prohibits. It never has in history, not even in Moslem history. and it never will. Muhammad at least had the argument of a climate, and not in the interest of a class. But if a test is needed, consider what part of Moslem culture has passed permanently into our own modern culture. You will find that the one Moslem poem that has really pierced is a Moslem poem in praise of wine. The crown of all the victories of the Crescent is that nobody reads the Koran and everybody reads the Rubaiyat. Most of us remember with satisfaction an old picture in Punch representing a festive old gentleman in a state of collapse on the pavement, and a philanthropic old lady anxiously calling the attention of a cabman to the calamity. The old lady says, "I'm sure this poor gentleman is ill," and the cabman replies with fervour, "Ill? I wish I'd had half his complaint." We talk about unconscious humour, but there is such a thing as unconscious seriousness. Flippancy is a flower whose roots are often underground in the subconsciousness. Many a man talks sense when he thinks he is talking nonsense, touches on a conflict of ideas as if it were only a contradiction of language, or really makes a parallel when he means only to make a pun. Some of the Punch jokes of the best period are examples of this, and that quoted above is a very strong example of it. The cabman meant what he said, but he said a great deal more than he meant. His utterance contained fine philosophical doctrines and distinctions of which he was not perhaps entirely conscious. The spirit of the English language, the tragedy and comedy of the condition of the English people, spoke through him as the god spoke through a tariff head or a brazen mask of oracle. And the oracle is an omen, and in some sense an omen of doom. Observe, to begin with, the sobriety of the cabman. Note his measure, his moderation, or to use the yet truer term, his temperance. He only wishes to have half the old gentleman's complaint. The old gentleman is welcome to the other half, along with all the other pomps and luxuries of his superior social station. There is nothing Bolshevist or even communist about the temperance cabman. He might almost be called distributionist, in the sense that he wishes to distribute the old gentleman's complaint more equally between the old gentleman and himself. And of course the social relations there represented are very much truer to life than it is fashionable to suggest. By the realism of this picture, Mr. Punch made amends for some more snobbish pictures with the opposite social moral. It will remain eternally among his real glories that he exhibited a picture in which the cabman was sober and the gentleman was drunk. Despite many ideas to the contrary, it was emphatically a picture of real life. The truth is subject to the simplest of all possible tests. If the cabman were really and truly drunk, he would not be a cabman, for he could not drive a cab. If he had the whole of the old gentleman's complaint, he would be sitting happily on the pavement beside the old gentleman, a symbol of social equality found at last, and the levelling of all classes of mankind. I do not say that there has never been such a monster known as a drunken cabman. I do not say that the driver may not sometimes have approximated imprudently to three-quarters of the complaint, instead of adhering to his severe but wise conception of half of it. But I do say that most men of the world, if they spoke sincerely, could testify to more examples of helplessly drunk gentlemen put inside cabs than of helplessly drunken drivers on top of them. Philanthropists and officials who never look at people, but only at papers, probably have a mass of social statistics to the contrary, founded on the simple fact that cabmen can be cross-examined about their habits, and gentlemen cannot. Social workers probably have the whole thing worked out in sections and compartments, showing how the extreme intoxication of cabmen compares with the parallel intoxication of costermongers, or measuring the drunkenness of a dustman against the drunkenness of a crossing sweeper. But there is more practical experience embodied in the practical speech of the English, and in the proverb that says, "As drunk as a lord." Now, prohibition, whether as a proposal in England or a pretence in America, simply means that the man who has drunk less shall have no drink, and the man who has drunk more shall have all the drink. It means that the old gentleman shall be carried home in a cab drunker than ever, but that in order to make it quite safe for him to drink to excess, the man who drives him shall be forbidden to drink even in moderation. That is what it means. That is all it means. That is all it ever will mean. It tends to that in Moslem countries, where the luxurious and advanced drink champagne, while the poor and fanatical drink water. It means that in modern America, where the wealthy are all at this moment sipping their cocktails and discussing how much harder labourers can be made to work if only they can be kept from festivity. This is what it means, and all it means. And men are divided about it according to whether they believe in a certain transcendental concept called justice, expressed in a more mystical paradox as the equality of men. So long as you do not believe in justice, and so long as you are rich and really confident of remaining so, you can have prohibition and be as drunk as you choose. I see that some remarks by the Reverend R.J. Campbell dealing with social conditions in America are reported in the press. They include some observations about Sinn Féin in which, as in most of Mr. Campbell's allusions to Ireland, it is not difficult to detect his dismal origin or the acrid smell of the smoke of Belfast. But the remarks about America are valuable in the objective sense, over and above their philosophy. He believes that prohibition will survive and be a success, nor does he seem himself to regard the prospect with any special disfavour. But he frankly and freely testifies to the truth I have asserted, that prohibition does not prohibit, so far as the wealthy are concerned. He testifies to constantly seeing wine on the table, as will any other grateful guest of the generous hospitality of America, and he implies humorously that he asked no questions about the story told him of the old stocks in the cellars. So there is no dispute about the facts, and we come back as before to the principles. Is Mr. Campbell content with a prohibition which is another name for privilege? If so, he has simply absorbed, along with his new theology, a new morality, which is different from mine. But he does state both sides of the inequality with equal logic and clearness, and in these days of intellectual fog that alone is like a ray of sunshine. Now, my primary objection to prohibition is not based on any arguments against it, but on the one argument for it. I need nothing more for its condemnation than the only thing that is said in its defence. It is said by capitalists all over America, and it is very clearly and correctly reported by Mr. Campbell himself. The argument is that employees work harder and therefore employers get richer. That this idea should be taken calmly by itself as the test of a problem of liberty is in itself a final testimony to the presence of slavery. It shows that people have completely forgotten that there is any other test except the servile test. Employers are willing that workmen should have exercise, as it may help them to do more work. They are even willing that workmen should have leisure, for the more intelligent capitalist can see that this also means that they can do more work. But they are not in any way willing that workmen should have fun, for fun only increases the happiness and not the utility of the worker. Fun is freedom, and in that sense is an end in itself. It concerns the man not as a worker but as a citizen, or even as a soul, and the soul in that sense is an end in itself. That a man shall have a reasonable amount of comedy and poetry and even fantasy in his life is part of his spiritual health, which is for the service of God, and not merely for his mechanical health, which is now bound to the service of man. The very test adopted has all the servile implication, the test of what we can get out of him, instead of the test of what he can get out of life. Mr. Campbell is reported to have suggested, doubtless rather as a conjecture than a prophecy, that England may find it necessary to become teetotal in order to compete commercially with the efficiency and economy of teetotal America. Well, in the 18th and early 19th centuries there was in America one of the most economical and efficient of all forms of labour. It did not happen to be feasible for the English to compete with it by copying it. There were so many humanitarian prejudices about in those days. But economically there seems to be no reason why a man should not have prophesied that England would be forced to adopt American slavery then, as she is urged to adopt American prohibition now. Perhaps such a prophet would have prophesied rightly. Certainly it is not impossible that universal slavery might have been the vision of Calhoun, as universal prohibition seems to be the vision of Campbell. The old England of 1830 would have said that such a plea for slavery was monstrous. But what would it have said of a plea for enforced water drinking? Nevertheless, the nobler servile state of Calhoun collapsed before it could spread to Europe, and there is always the hope that the same may happen to the far more materialistic utopia of Mr. Campbell and soft drinks. Abstract morality is very important, and it may well clear the mind to consider what would be the effect of prohibition in America if it were introduced there. It would, of course, be a decisive departure from the tradition of the Declaration of Independence. Those who deny that are hardly serious enough to demand attention. It is enough to say that they are reduced to minimizing that document in defense of prohibition, exactly as the slave owners were reduced to minimizing it in defense of slavery. They are reduced to saying that the fathers of the Republic meant no more than that they would not be ruled by a king. And they are obviously open to the reply which Lincoln gave to Douglas on the slavery question, that if that great charter was limited to certain events in the 18th century, it was hardly worth making such a fuss about it in the 19th or in the 20th. But they are also open to another reply, which is even more to the point, when they pretend that Jefferson's famous preamble only means to say that monarchy is wrong. They are maintaining that Jefferson only meant to say something that he does not say at all. The great preamble does not say that all monarchical government must be wrong. On the contrary, it rather implies that most government is right. It speaks of human governments in general as justified by the necessity of defending certain personal rights. I see no reason whatever to suppose that it would not include any royal government that does defend those rights. Still less do I doubt what it would say of a republican government that does destroy those rights. But what are those rights? Sophists can always debate about their degree, but even sophists cannot debate about their direction. Nobody in his five wits will deny that Jeffersonian democracy wished to give the law a general control in more public things, but the citizens a more general liberty in private things. Wherever we draw the line, liberty can only be personal liberty, and the most personal liberties must at least be the last liberties we lose. But today they are the first liberties we lose. It is not a question of drawing the line in the right place, but of beginning at the wrong end. What are the rights of man if they do not include the normal right to regulate his own health in relation to the normal risks of diet and daily life? Nobody can pretend that beer is a poison, as prussic acid is a poison, that all the millions of civilized men who drank it all fell down dead when they had touched it. Its use and abuse is obviously a matter of judgment, and there can be no personal liberty if it is not a matter of private judgment. It is not in the least a question of drawing the line between liberty and license. If this is license, there is no such thing as liberty. It is plainly impossible to find any right more individual or intimate. To say that a man has a right to a vote, but not a right to a voice about the choice of his dinner, is like saying that he has a right to his hat, but not a right to his head. The end of section 19.